In this particular clip, Farrokhzad wanted to explain that it wasn't just Iranian artists that could portray and give meaning to subjectivity in life, but also they could be poets also and recreate a different way of conveying that message to the audience. She wanted to make sure that the person that she was talking to realized that she thinks about these different issues and she wanted to address them in a particular manner that was suitable to what she wanted to do. Finds unexpected grace where few would think to look. A leper colony whose inhabitants live, worship, learn, play, and celebrate in a self contained community cut off from the rest of the world. Through remnant voiceover narration drawn from the Old Testament, the Quran, and the filmmaker's own poetry and unflinching images that refuse to look away from physical difference, Farrokhzad creates a profoundly empathetic patriot portrait of this cast of by a society, a face-to-face encounter with the humanity behind the disease. However, this film was one of the most subversive undercurrents in the film. Its subtle criticism of Islam and a religion in general for failing to take more compassionate and helpful interest in these forgotten and suffering people. Farrokhzad continually shows the leper praying and giving thanks to God, and she purposely contrasts their faith and devotion against the abjection of their condition. After doing further research, I read and also noticed something in the beginning. It states that on the screen, you will see an image of ugliness, a vision of pain no caring human being should ignore. And this echoes the sentiments of the poet Sadi of Shiraz, who in the 13th century famously declared, "You are indifferent to the misery of others who cannot be called a human being." The ugliness, however, turns out to be something of a euphemism. While some of Farrokhzad's subjects are being treated for leprosy at an early stage, others haven't been as fortunate. In the first scene, a girl regards what is exposed of her mutilated face in a mirror. Elsewhere, a blind, noseless man handless a cigarette with mere stubs for fingers. Farrokhzad does not, however, treat any of them as anomalies or grotesque, but as people, and her empathy is accentuated by her passionate reading of her poetry. Also, when watching and interpreting the way she visualized this particular film, you start to notice how the poem is connecting with the cinematography of the film. You realize that conjecturally they intertwine with each other. And when you notice these things, you see a lot of symmetrical things. I remember seeing a particular scene where a man was under trees, and he was walking out of a building, and when you look at that particular scene, you see how similar things are, and how she wanted you to visualize as the audience what she was trying to say. And I find that very fascinating and very unique at the same time. And and then it jumped straight into scenes of birds flocking in the sky. So not only do you get a nature aspect of it, but also the humanism involved in it as well. So the goal was to dive in depth with more of the meaning behind The House is Black. What I realized is that The House is Black has taken on even more meaning in the context of, let's say, the coronavirus pandemic. For one, it can make those self-isolating appreciate what they have. Our pandemic will pass, but for the quarantine patients in the film, especially those with leprosy, illness, and isolation from the rest of the society, are facts of life. They have no recovery to look forward to, passing out their days in a slow decay. I am poured out like water, as those who have long been dead, Farrukhsad says in her voiceover. On my eyelids is the shadow of death. With that said, there's some light in the film. Children giggling at school, and while playing football, dealing with the situations as best they can, while other patients are shown making merry at a wedding. The film's contrasting of scenes in a hospital in which Goldstein discusses the treatment of leprosy with those of fatalistic worshippers submitting to the will of God in a mosque says volume about the conflicting attitude of and towards science and religion in Iran. And when it comes to religion and science in Iran, people definitely have their own conceptual opinions and ideas. So when it comes to this particular film, you can certainly stand as a metaphor in Iran and the Pura nation battling a pandemic under crippling U.S. sanctions, costing ordinary Iranians their lives at an alarming rate. And perhaps the film's most harrowing scene, a schoolboy is asked to write a sentence on a blackboard with the word house. He thinks to himself before scrawling with his damaged fingers, the house. So I wanted to focus on what drives her, what compels her to want to convey these messages and want to find meaning, and just pretty much want to explain the research that she does in the film. So I realized that she was driven by a compulsive introspection, which she used to pin blatantly condemnation of the section of Iranian culture and politics that disgusted her. Conversely, The House is Black is a film which insists on compassion towards a discarded people, a fault of the global community for which people, perhaps even decades later, should feel responsible. Farrukhsad said in a 1965 interview with Bernardo Bertolucci that an intellectual is one who, besides trying for the external development of life, tries for the spiritual advancement, for the improvement of the moral issues. Through her poetry, she undoubtedly achieved an intellectual freedom from the restrictions she was subjected to as an Iranian citizen and woman. But much like Farrukhsad's poem, The House is Black pushes the viewers and its subjects to strive for some kind of freedom, whether it's emotional, spiritual, or political. Her career contains within itself the multiple complexities of how educated women were required to participate in mid-century Iran. The artist, not least because of her obvious talent, but able to publish her revolutionary poetry in notable Iranian journals, from which she was both lauded and criticized for. But praise always came from those who wanted nothing but to admire the work of an unquestionably great writer. Her work for the Paris Review became an icon. She became an icon in her country, but she was also considered a threat to less talented people, usually male bands of its intellectia. Farrukhsad has the freedom to work as she pleased, but not with the derision and condescension that was leveled at her.